Hi, I'm a possum and I find garbage, and welcome to Fast Trash. Today's Fast Trash is Dark Universe, not to be confused with Universal's ill-fated attempt to make a cinematic universe out of their old monster movies. No, this is a low-budget movie about a xenomorph wannabe that sucks blood, not to be confused with my ex-wife. The movie starts as all good movies do, in space. This astronaut named Steve is flying around in a spaceship called the Nautilus, which is a stupid name for anything that isn't underwater. The Nautilus is apparently made of old video switches, which I guess is all you need when you fly around in space, because Steve isn't wearing a spacesuit, and he doesn't even have a seat. He talks to some guy sitting next to a mixing board, then he complains about it getting cold. It turns out there's some kind of alien spore infesting the life support system. By the way, this is something I see in science fiction a lot, but your spaceship wouldn't get cold if the life support system failed. One of the big challenges of spaceship design is getting rid of waste heat due to the fact that there's no air to convect it away. So if anything, it should start getting really hot in there. Anyway, the point is there's some kind of alien thing going on, things start blowing up, and the guy turns into some kind of monster. Then the spaceship crashes. The crash is witnessed by these two idiots making out in a hut somewhere in Florida, but they think it's a meteor.
Meteorite.
F you. Then we see Steve, now fully monsterfied, emerge from the wreckage of the Nautilus. Sometime later, these two other idiots, I'm gonna call Mr. and Mrs. Filler because they have nothing to do with the plot, or wander around the woods and get killed. Then we cut to some random shot of this mom opening a bag of chips for a stupid kid because he can't do it himself. Then we see some people get on an airboat with some bad ADR.
We want Tom Hanning. How far in does he live?
Old Tom Hanning, he's pretty fur. He's back in there, but...
The boat takes off, then we cut to that woman in the hut from earlier watching TV. The mixing board guy, who's some kind of millionaire running his own private space program, talks about how the Nautilus burned up during re-entry and Steve died, so nobody should go looking for them. The fanboy arrives and this reporter woman, her producer, and a fat archaeologist go up to the hut and ask the woman about old Tom Hanning, who's supposed to be some kind of guide for the swamps of Florida, because they're looking for some ancient Native American burial ground. But old Tom Hanning is dead, so they're stuck with his son, Tom Hanning Jr. We cut to some old guy following his dog named Cracker in the woods. He finds one of his traps with a half-eaten animal carcass in it, touches the bloody part with his bare hands, and then he finds Cracker dead, and then Steve shows up and chases him. And of course the movie does that monster vision thing, where we see what the monster sees, and apparently the monster sees everything in the wrong aspect ratio. So the old guy gets killed, but don't worry, he never gets brought up again. Then we see the two guys who Fat Guy hired to do grunt work for him talk about Twinkies.
Golden sponge cake with creamy filling.
Did Hostess actually pay to have their product associated with this movie? How embarrassing. I mean, for the movie. It couldn't even get made without Hostess putting up some Twinkie money for it. Then everyone begins to journey into the second act, I mean the swamp. And I ain't talking about the government, I mean an actual swamp, like the kind Jimmy Carter got attacked by a rabbit in. This guy, whose name I can't be bothered to remember, so I'm just gonna call him Joe Camel, just because he looks like the kind of guy who stinks of cigarettes, thinks he hears something. So he wanders off by himself like some kind of idiot, and doesn't see anything. And then he goes back and tells Twinkie Guy he feels like they're being watched. Then Tom tells him about how dangerous the swamp is.
This swamp can kill you in more ways you think possible. You step up this path, you'll find them. Snakes, alligators.
Don't forget rabbits. So everyone continues into the swamp and they set up camp. They talk about nothing, then Steve shows up and watches them from behind the trees and has flashbacks to the beginning of the movie, because apparently that's when his life started and he has no memories from before then. Sometime later, Joe Camel wanders off again to smoke and sees God's most magnificent creature. Then he gets knocked out and clawed by Steve. Back at the camp, Twinkie Guy gets up to look for Joe Camel, then Tom points out that Fat Guy's story doesn't make any sense, because whatever in Native American tribe he was talking about didn't live there at the time or whatever. So Fat Guy pulls a gun on him, but he doesn't know how to use it.
I don't want to, but I'll shoot you if I have to.
No, you won't. You left the safety on.
Then they hear Twinkie Guy yelling, so Tom gives the gun back to Fat Guy for some reason. Then they find Joe Camel, who turns out to still be alive. They drag him back to camp, and then we cut to Hut Lady for no reason. Then reporter woman explains to Tom that mixing board guy is a millionaire who runs his own space program and lied about the Nautilus burning up in re-entry to keep the government from finding it, and sent Fat Guy in to find it, and he's some kind of alien biologist. And she made a deal with mixing board guy that she would get to be the first to report on it. You're gonna have to excuse me for a minute. I have to go take an info dump. Producer guy shows up and tells him Joe Camo's gonna be okay, but he needs to stay at the camp, so Twinkie guy is gonna stay with him while the rest of them go looking for the spaceship. The next morning, Tom, reporter woman, producer guy, and fat guy continue walking through the swamp, and producer guy comments that the swamp looks like it's radically different even though it looks exactly the same. Then they suddenly find the spaceship covered in a strange orange mold. Fat guy collects some samples, and he and Tom look around the surrounding area before checking inside the spaceship. They find some strange tracks on the ground, then we cut to reporter woman and producer guy recording the news report.
3, 2, 1. Like Icarus in Greek mythology.
You're not supposed to do the countdown out loud. The whole point is to allow transition time for the edit. I thought you were professional. When they're done with the video, producer guy and reporter woman take off their clothes so they can screw around. But then a mutant armadillo bites producer guy's leg, and he just kind of sits there and lets it happen for a minute before he finally gets up. Then fat guy shows up and shoots at it, and he trips, just sits there long enough for the thing to jump on him. Tom runs up and pulls the armadillo off fat guy and beats it to death with a stick. Then producer guy faints. Tom takes fat guy back to the spaceship to show him the inside, which is full of more orange mold. Based on no information whatsoever, Tom reasons that the mold came from outside the ship while it was in space and made its way in, and it's quickly spreading. Fat guy speculates the spores from the mold cause other life forms to turn into orange goo-filled monsters. I once got full of orange goo when I ate too much duck sauce. It didn't turn me into a monster though. The war did that. Why is it called duck sauce anyway? We cut to the hut where nothing happens, then back to the swamp, where Tom and the others call Twinkie guy at the camp and tell the radio the hut lady to tell her to contact the authorities to warn everyone about the orange mold. But before Twinkie guy can relay the message, Steve shows up and this happens. I like that rubber stretching sound. Then the monster goes after Twinkie guy and the others hear the gunshots coming from the camp. They make their way back to the camp and find Twinkie guy and Joe Campbell's dried out bodies. And it's at this point that I notice there's monkey noises coming from the swamps of Florida. Fun fact, it turns out there actually are sporadic populations of monkeys in Florida due to some idiot releasing them in the 1930s to spice up his boat tours. And a lot of them have herpes for some reason. They pull a thing out of Twinkie guy's hand, then sometime later, fat guy is exposing the mutant tissue to chemicals, I guess just to see what happens. For no reason at all, he puts the flask on a box behind him, where it's completely out of his line of sight, and while he screws around with the thing he pulled out of Twinkie guy's hand. Then the flask explodes, causing fat guy to fall off his stool. He sees the yellow thing grow into a giant slug thing, and just sits there like an idiot as it starts to crawl around. It suddenly shoots up into the canopy thing, and somehow he loses sight of it. And then, because he was too stupid to get out from under the canopy, it suddenly but predictably plops down on his back. Fat guy panics because he's too stupid to just take his jacket off, so reporter woman takes it off for him. Then Tom pours sulfuric acid on it, which dissolves the slug but not the jacket. Then they decide they need to burn everything the mold has come into contact with, so Fat Guy and Tom go get more firewood. While they're gone, producer guy wakes up and attacks reporter woman, but Tom and Fat Guy show up just in time to save her. They fight for a while, but then producer guy starts screaming as a black slug thing pops out of his neck, which Tom smashes with a stick. Then producer guy dies. Later that night, Fat Guy suggests there might be some kind of intelligence guiding the behavior of the mold, even though it hasn't done anything to demonstrate intelligence thus far. Just because you tell us your movie's monster is smart, that doesn't make it so. He also explains that he examined the mutant tissue they pried from Twinkie Guy's hand and found human DNA, and they immediately jump to the conclusion that it's Steve's. He's also anemic and has to drink blood.
Doesn't make any sense. I mean, if you and I needed more red cells, it wouldn't do us any good to drink blood. Blood has no nutritive value.
Steve watches from the bushes and has flashbacks which don't add anything to the movie. Then Fat Guy gets up to get more firewood and just goes by himself. Why is it that the one guy who's a scientist is also the dumbest person here? Fat Guy sees Steve and runs back to the camp. Tom shoots at Steve. but it does no good. So Fat Guy and Reporter Woman run while Tom stays behind to fight Steve to buy them time. Just as it appears Steve is about to kill him, he gets distracted by another flashback, enabling Tom to escape. We cut to the hut where Hut Lady waits for Tom to call her on the radio when suddenly Steve attacks. Hut Lady screams for a while when Tom suddenly comes awkwardly flopping through the wall to save her. Hut Lady runs out of the hut, then, for no discernible reason, Tom decides to stay inside the hut to fight Steve even though Steve is outside, where everyone else is, and of course Steve gets the drop on him. Outside, the others realize they don't have any weapons capable of killing Steve, so Fat Guy decides to try reasoning with him, his logic being that Steve used to be human and might remember what it's like. You ever stop to think that maybe he does, and that's the problem? I mean, I'd be pretty pissed too if I crawled out of a spaceship wreckage looking like a cheap xenomorph knockoff. So Fat Guy walks up to Steve and tries to talk to him, and it goes about as well as you'd expect. Hut Lady picks up a flare gun and says the swamp is full of marsh gas, which is flammable, so maybe they can light Steve on fire.
No, it has to get closer. Come on, you son of a bitch! Come get us!
Wait, I thought you were trying to lure him over there. Why are you running up to him? So of course Steve grabs her, and Hut Lady can't shoot without hitting Reporter Lady, so she yells Steve's name, distracting him, then she shoots.
Suck on this!
Reporter Woman and Hut Lady just stand there as Steve burns to death. Then Tom walks up and hugs Hut Lady. Then Reporter Lady looks at a mark on her hands, implying she's been infected. We cut to Mixing Board Guy talking about how they're gonna try launching more spaceships.
It is a dark, dark universe out there.
He said it!
Then the movie ends. So that's Dark Universe. Like this video, leave a comment because the algorithm likes it, subscribe, send me your fan art, and support me on Patreon.